right. Welcome back, everybody, to another Future Focused, where we are living at the intersection of business, technology, and the human experience while hopefully keeping you 10 steps ahead of where we are. Today, we are going to be talking about, I think, a very important topic of how do we think about diversity in technology, but not just for the sake of diversity, but really the impact it has as we go through into the AI age and the implications it has and why it matters. So to navigate this conversation with me, I am joined by William A. Adams. He is a seasoned technologist. That's what we decided on backstage. So I'm looking forward to this, William, and I'm so glad that you accepted my invitation to be on. I think your experience and even just the fun we had chatting backstage, we're going to have a good conversation.
Well, thank you, Christopher, for having me, and let's roll.
Yeah, let's do it. Let's do it. So for those who may not be and by the way, this is completely unrelated to the topic, but I always get a kick out of this. When the intro music's rolling, I can see the camera of the person, and sometimes, but you were jamming to it, which I always do the same thing. I'm always kind of bouncing to it because I like my intro music. So I always enjoy when I see other people enjoying it as much as I do.
Yeah, we are not robots, right?
No, we are not. So for folks who may not be as familiar with you as I have, as I've kind of gotten to know you through this process, who is William A. Adams, and what is kind of your backstory in the tech space?
Yeah, so for those who aren't looking at me, I'm a black guy. I'm 59. This is I'm cruising through my 60th year on this planet, and I've been a tech guy since I was about 12. So way back before the Apple I, before the TRS-80, around the time of the TRS-80, the Commodore PET was my first computer, before the Atari 2600. So I've been in tech forever. And I'm self-taught in that way. I taught myself assembly language programming and all sorts of other stuff as a 12-year-old,
Yeah.
Because there was no one around to teach you that stuff. There was no YouTube. There was no,
you couldn't just go on the internet and look things up.
No, there was no internet.
No, there was.
Later came computer clubs and stuff like that you could hang out with people. But it was just like there's a couple of magazines, and this thing came along called bulletin boards. If you're lucky enough to have a beep modem, So I've been tech forever, and I ultimately went to UC Berkeley, studied electrical engineering, and pretty soon in the early 80s, I formed a company with my brother, and we did software, and it was the heyday of, we're going to change the world. So we did some software stuff. We latched on to Next Computers when Steve Jobs formed that company. We did that for a while until they petered out. And ultimately in 1998, I joined Microsoft. And it was to work on this thing called XML, which is just a file format that's out there in the world, like HTML. And various things at Microsoft. I did that for 24 years. I did everything from shipping core components to helping us establish our development environment, our dev teams in India. I lived in India for 3 years. I helped develop some of the first services on Azure. And I ultimately was the first technical advisor in the office of the CTO, Kevin Scott. And then I did some other things, and then I left. One of the things I did in there before I was in the office of the CTO was this thing called LEAP, which was a program to help us hire women and minorities into the company. And that was a big deal, and it's still running today. And it's more than just go find 5 or 10 black folks. It's like, how do you really change the culture of the company to recognize that people are of value with lots of different perspectives and backgrounds in the world. So that's my life in a nutshell. And now I'm doing other stuff.
So out of curiosity on the background side, and we'll do a little bit of a trip down memory lane to get us to the future side of it. But I think back to even my early days in dorking around with computer components, and that was in the 90s, so what drew you to it, and even access to it? Because I even think for me in the 90s, I mean, I was in a small town, rural Minnesota. it wasn't even like now where everybody had, I mean, even we take for granted the fact like most households have a computer and people are
Yeah.
holding basically a mini computer in their hand. Back then, that was not the case. I
Yeah.
remember even getting computer parts was not, you couldn't just like go to the local store and be like, hey, I want to pick up a new motherboard or throw another stick of RAM in my computer. It just wasn't even, so how did
Yeah.
that end up coming together for you?
Well, for me, lucky for me, by the 80s, so I went off to college in 1982.
Okay.
So for me, um, I was up in Silicon Valley,
Okay.
and that is where it was all happening. So you
Okay.
could, in fact, go down to the local. We had a
Oh,
place called Fry's Electronics. It was down in Palo Alto.
got
And
it.
Fry's Electronics was the place where all the hardware and software engineers went to find their bits and pieces, and there are a couple other stores like that. So you could, in fact,
Interesting.
because a lot
So
of that
you
stuff was
actually
actually
could,
made
even
there.
in the 80s, you could see like Renville,
Yeah,
Minnesota, out in the sticks of
nothing.
farmland. There was not, I could go to the seed farm and maybe get some seeds or maybe, a shovel for my yard, but that was about it. That there
Yeah,
was no like, hey, I need a new part for my Pentium 133. It was like, yeah,
yeah.
well, we ain't got that.
I mean, luckily for me, or by design, I guess, divine design. I was in the place where all that stuff was actually being made, so
That's super cool.
it was plentiful. You could dumpster dive and find stuff,
Really?
if you really wanted to. I mean, that was true when I grew up in Southern California as well. I was surrounded. We were on the edge of Orange County, which is let's call it a bedroom community to Los Angeles. But there was aerospace technology. Rockwell International was down the street from me, and literally I was a dumpster diving kid because you could find all sorts of electronics components just in the dumpsters, right?
Yeah.
So on one side of the street, there's orange fields and strawberry fields, and on the other, there's Rockwell International. So I was always surrounded by electronics stuff.
Okay.
And my father was a typewriter repairman, so I always had this tinkerer, attitude. I had a
Yeah.
rector set, and I was always a tinkerer. So
Okay.
I would find the stuff, or I would go salvage it or whatever, right?
Okay. Okay. Well, it's funny. Typewriter repair person. What's great about that is, we hear all this stuff with AI changing the way work does, and people go, oh no, like it might take jobs away or jobs may disappear. And I'm like, they've been disappearing for a long
Forever.
time. So when you said typewriter repair person, like, yeah, I
We
don't
don't
know
even
too
have
many people that
typewriters
are
anymore.
exactly. But there was more of a sense of even tinkering that I think even in some ways is lost. We were joking about it backstage that, here you're working with some parts and pieces like that. And that again, kind of brought me back to my early days where you actually built a computer. You actually
Yeah.
put the pieces in. I actually remember taking a computer repair class where that's all we did for a semester was take apart and reassemble computers, type of a thing. So we've come a
Yeah.
long ways in many ways, and yet in some ways it's still very similar.
Yeah, and that's like I said, back then the components you were dealing with were things like the motherboard, RAM, graphics card, audio card, big components. All
Yeah.
of those components have made their way down to the single motherboard. So now it's just a choice of which power supply, what's the case design you're sticking in it, that sort of thing. But at the same time, the computers are so here's my prop, the computers are so small.
They are.
That's the computer. That little silver box right there is way more powerful than even the PCs I was building in the 90s. That
Oh,
little tiny thumbnail of a thing is complete Wi-Fi, Bluetooth, CPU, RAM,
yeah, it's got the whole thing. I mean, I
right?
remember you used to have a desktop case, not necessarily because they were cool. Like now people with desktops, it's like a, image, like, I'm a gamer. I've got a liquid
Yeah,
cool,
there's a
all this
rig.
other
It's a
stuff.
rig.
Right. But really the parts are pretty small. Where back then it's like
Right.
you actually needed that much real
Yeah, because
estate
the parts are that
to
big.
fit it in. You actually couldn't fit it in if you didn't have a PCI slot. You need 3 PCI slots and you had all these
Yeah.
other things. Couldn't fit in a laptop.
Yeah, so here we are. The stuff is all shrinky dink down. It's all super powerful, and you find yourself not dealing with the components in a single computer, but how do you bring a set of computers together to do a task, right? Whether
Okay.
it be robot control or running a factory or whatever.
Okay. So, so transitioning on to the diversity piece, I am curious, not necessarily to sit and dwell on the past of it, but that experience, I think, I have to imagine would be different than probably many people would expect if you're not coming from that background. But then
Yeah.
on top of it, sometimes, especially being in the HR space, over the years, I've heard things like, oh, well, we really need to have more diversity in tech. And it's said as this very just like, go find some people to do this. And
Yeah.
my observation has been it's more complicated than that because there is a whole just lot of aspects going into that. So what was that experience like for you? Because I mean, I just know the tech space well enough to know it's not like it's dominated by a diverse audience of people participating. It really just isn't and hasn't
Yeah.
been for a very long time.
Yeah, I mean, it's a one of the questions you asked me that I didn't quite answer is how was I drawn to it? I was
Yeah.
a shy kid, and the fact that I would just kind of be able to go in my room and program an assembly language on a computer is like nirvana to me, because it's like,
Yeah.
oh, it's just I'm in my little shell. I can do my thing. I don't care what anyone else thinks. I'm not reliant on anyone. Perfect, right? That's
Yeah.
what probably drew me to it in the first place. So for the longest time, being the only black dude doing whatever never really occurred to me that much.
Okay.
I just did what I did, right?
Yeah.
And there was plenty of places where it was obvious. It's like, well, you're not getting this same opportunity. And it's still true today. You're not going to get this opportunity because you're black, or rather, because you're not in the dominant culture is the proper way
Okay.
to say it. Because even when I was in India, the reason I wasn't able to do certain things wasn't because I was black. It was because I was not Indian, right?
Really?
And when I was in Africa setting up a development center there would be limitations, not because I wasn't black, because everyone was black. It's
You just
because I
weren't the
wasn't from a
dominant, you
certain
weren't the
tribe.
dominant culture.
Yeah, I wasn't Kenyan, right? So there's always places where you're not the dominant culture thing, whatever it is.
Yeah.
In the US, in tech, it used to be the dominant thing was white males,
Yeah. White
right?
dudes.
If you roll forward to today and look at a lot of companies in tech, and I'm sure I'll offend some people by saying this, it's not white guys, it's a bunch of Indian guys now. And again, I'm not Indian either. Even though my
Yeah.
wife is Indian, I lived in India, I speak the language, I'm not Indian. So I'm not going to be part of that dominant culture that's making lots of decisions. And I'm not trying to be racist. I'm just speaking the facts, right?
Yeah.
The halls of the company that I left is dominated by different cultures now. It used to be dominated by white guys in leadership. Now it's dominated by Indians in leadership. So monocultures are always not great, no matter who's
Yeah.
at the helm.
Yeah. It doesn't matter who's the
Doesn't
dominant
matter
culture. It's just whenever
yeah.
it's monochromatic, it just isn't
Right.
the best.
And it's a human nature thing. I mean, and this is why I don't say, oh, it's them. It's like, it's us. It's human
Yeah.
nature to be tribal. It's human nature to discriminate. It's human nature to say us versus them, right?
Yeah.
It's hard for us to break away from that because this is how we got as far as we are today, right? We are the tribes that survived, right? By
Right.
banding together and saying us, them, war, we win, they lose. We survive, they don't. So it's human nature that brings us to these things. And it's by human intellect that we try to go behind it, right? And I think as we talk more about the AI thing, it'll become apparent. It's like, oh my gosh, the us is humanity and the them is
Yeah.
the machines.
Well,
So
before we jump into that, two of the things that you brought out there that I think are really key in, I think, addressing some of these things that can be helpful, that is this shared space is, it's easy, I think, sometimes when we think about our tribal nature, like you said, we kind of like bond together with the people that we feel most similar to. And
yeah.
like you said, it's just how we tend to operate. But it's interesting how quickly we do that based on things that are most observable. versus the things that are under the surface, because the exact thing that drew you to tech was the exact same thing that drew me to tech. It's kind of socially awkward, not super outgoing. Like the idea of being able to do something by myself and be really focused on it. And like, that's a shared space. So it's like, well, there's actually a lot of similarity in that, but that wouldn't necessarily present itself at the surface. So if we were to walk by each other on the street, we wouldn't necessarily go, we wouldn't go, you know what, we're two of the same kind. Like we actually probably would have some really unique components.
Right. Unless you're wearing a badge that says I'm a geek, you know, it's like, hey, my geek brother, you know, it's like, how would I know?
Right. Well, and I think, but I think that goes back to where we have some opportunity now. And this is some of the work that I do in the HR space, is to try and say, how do we help people better understand those things that make them tick that don't necessarily present on the surface? Because again, I see the thing where you'll hear companies go, oh, we need to get diversity in tech, as though you can just go recruit people from a certain ethno background and go, this'll work. And it's like, well, no, because if they're a certain personality type or they gravitate towards these certain things and you throw them into computer programming, they're going to fail. They're going to not be happy anyway. And so what? So you achieved a metric, but it's not really going to get you there.
Right. Yeah. And I think the twist there is to not make your metric based on this outward DNA test, right? It's the metric truly, and I've answered this question a lot for people. It's like, well, you know, what should it be based on? It's like, well, the only way diversity works for a company is when there's a business imperative to have a diverse workforce, because that's going to be most profitable, right? And it's not like, oh, okay, therefore we have 20% of this, 30% of that. No, what you're really after is diverse perspectives and experiences, right? You want to, if you're selling, I don't know, you're selling, you know, software, generalized software, you want as broad as an audience as possible. So of course you want to include something for farmers and something for textile workers and something for factories and something for, you know, white collar workers. Well, the best way you can get their perspectives in so that you can create stuff for them is to hire people from those perspectives, right? Hire some farmers, you know, or at least hire people who grew up around farms. Yeah, if you want to know what farmers
want, what they care about and what they think, it's probably good to ask some of them or include them in that process.
Right. And it's not good enough to just send your MIT bred people, regardless of color, out to the farms to do interviews and think they're just so smart they'll just figure it out. It's like, no, farmers are geniuses too. Try to hire a couple of them. Right? Have a real honest, and that's how you get the diversity. Now, in some cases, that's going to lead you to have DNA diversity, because, you know, it's like, well, 80% of the farmers are Black. Okay, well, then it means that you're going to hire some Black people, right? I'm just making up numbers, but if you go about it like that, where it's a business imperative that you increase your perspectives, that's one thing. And the other is, of course, if you broaden your horizons of who you bring in, you're going to bring in people that operate better. Like, okay, I'm going to take some experienced people from the biotech space, people who've worked in collaborative labs. Well, they probably know how to collaborate. So since a lot of software is about collaboration, I might as well hire some people that know how to collaborate. Oh, it turns out that all the biotech lab people are women. Okay, well, I guess you're going to hire a bunch of women then.
Yeah.
Right.
So when you think about that, though, because I think, you know, you obviously have grown up in this space, and I just know from even just my own experiences, sometimes it can be hard to want to step into space where you feel like an outsider.
Yeah.
You know, you're like, like I maybe like the same things, but I definitely, like you said, when you were in India, you definitely weren't Indian. So it can be hard to do that. I feel that way whenever I go to a place where people are into sports, because I'm not into sports. And so I always feel like, ooh, I don't know how I'm going to have these conversations. And this could be, What are some of the things that you've observed that works well to help people cross that divide? Because I can see where it has to be intimidating no matter what for someone. If it's like, hey, we really want to bring in, let's say we want to have more diversity on our tech team. Well, that can be really intimidating if 90% is a certain way and you're going, well, just grab the one person to come help balance the equation. What has worked well to make that a less
Less
difficult transition?
jarring.
Yeah,
Less difficult for who? The 90% or the 1%?
I would say both. Because I think,
Yes. So the 90% has to just kind of get over itself and say, what are we afraid of? We're the 90%.
right,
It's like,
right.
why are you afraid? I mean, you're the dominant thing. Bringing in one person or 10 people or 10% or 20%. Are you really that frail that you can't handle any change whatsoever? Right. So that's the first thing. And I don't shame people into that. I just point out that you are the dominant part of the culture here.
Yeah.
Right. You have to be able to open your eyes. Now, in the case of the LEAP program, we did it by not tricking people, but just by showing them slowly. It's like, look, you can hire these people. Look how useful they are to you. Look how valuable it is to you. So putting things in terms that are helpful to them rather than making them feel like they're threatened, like, oh, the other is going to take your job. It's like, the other's not going to take your job. The other is going to help make you richer.
Yeah.
Right. The other is going to make you rich. Oh, I didn't think about that. It's like, yeah, that's right. They're going to make you rich. Now, for the 2% who are coming into the dominant culture, it's a lot harder because it's like,
Yeah.
well, you had to help people establish network. And this is what I tell people all the time. As you are the minority coming into a dominant culture, you need to establish as quickly as possible your network of support, right?
Okay.
Whether it's within there or it's across things, you need a mentor, you need coaches, you need people who are just going to say, yeah, I feel for the empathizers. You need that network, right? Because if you just walk in there on your own without a network, first time you meet with adversity and you have nowhere to turn to commiserate or support, you're just going to go, I hate this. This sucks. I'm out.
Yeah.
Right. I'm going back to my own. So I think that it's super important for the 2%ers who are coming in to establish network, and it's not to cover, to use that word. You don't want to show up. It's like, I'm the white guy. I'm the one black guy who shows up to the white fraternity. I don't want to suddenly become white, right?
Yeah.
I want to stay black. So I'm not going to just cover and pass and try to get along and try to make myself like you. I'm going to show up with myself and I'm going to reinforce who I am. I had to do this when I went to India. I literally went there with nothing, a backpack, literally a backpack.
Wow.
And I had to say, who am I? Right? What are my values? I grew up in America where flashy car, big house, and everything else was who you were. And here it's like, I have nothing. So who am I? Right. And this is a soul searching sort of thing that us 2%ers have to do, is to say, who are you? What is your true culture? What is your true nature? Put things around you that reinforce that so that you can survive in this harsh environment, this stark environment that isn't filled with that. Right.
Well, and I love that you hit on this, because I think, again, sometimes I hear, you hear these conversations and it can seem like, well, this only applies to this specific use case. But what you just described there, I actually think that's extremely valuable for everybody to do with whatever, because it is very easy. There's a lot of pressure a lot of times to just assimilate to whatever environment you're in. And you kind of lose who you are because you're just like, well, I am whatever the environment I'm now assimilating into. And that can actually be a very lonely place because you're not true to you.
If you know who you are.
Well, but I think that's the point you made, is actually getting to know, like, who am I actually, can help you prevent putting on that veneer and placating and pretending to be something you're not, which ultimately will make you miserable. I mean, belonging, as much of a squishy word as that can feel, is actually a really important factor. And I see it all the time when you deal with like new employees to any new company. If they don't feel like they belong, they don't stick.
Yeah.
They just don't stick because they go, this isn't really for me. And that support network, so knowing who you are, but then also that support network of, hey, where do I go where I feel safe and feel like I belong, even if it's maybe not right here, but I can kind of fall back on that. Those two things. I don't know anybody where you go, well, that's only good for Black people in tech.
That's good for everybody.
That's just good advice for anybody to be successful from a career standpoint.
Yeah, and I think it's also important that people come to they have to find their story in wherever they're going, right? It's like, okay, you took the job, you got the big paycheck. Is this going to work for you for the next 10, 15 years? Or are you just grinding it out, right? Is your story here? Or is this temporary? I think it's important to find your story in a place, or you can just look at your job as a 9 to 5 and it's like, yeah, that's what I do for work. That's what I do to put food on the table. I got this whole other set of things going on that I could care less what happens at work. It's just a paycheck, right? That's another way of living as well. It's harder. Some jobs you can do that, but when you're really putting your all into it, it's hard to really have that attitude. But that's a way to go as well. It's like, it's just a job. Who cares if I fit in? As long as they pay me, I don't care.
On that one, it's actually interesting since we're talking about just some of the like cultural, ethnical stereotypes that kind of go around. Like I actually see that from a generational shift as well. The younger generation really is intermixing and intertwining their purpose and identity with their work a lot. And they're really looking for that. I think a lot of generations have done that and they maybe don't necessarily realize it. They've been assimilating and building their identity in that. But I do think it used to be more acceptable or understandable where it was like you described, where it was like, I just go to work, I do my thing, I show up and I go home. So you know what? If I don't fit in, if I'm not part of the clique, I actually really don't care because I just go and I do my thing and then I come home and my life is outside of work. But as work, and I actually think technology played a big role in this because suddenly we were fully integrated. There wasn't like, I punch the clock, I'm out. All of a sudden it was like, well, my work friends are my friends and my communication that's happening is across the board. All of a sudden it became a lot more difficult where not belonging in your work environment changed
means you might not have a social environment either.
Right. It might mean you have no friends and no support network because it's like, well, you don't click. So therefore you've got nothing.
Yeah. And this is, that may have in the past or even today get filled in by other structures like it's like, okay, there's work, but I got my church group that I'm a part of and that's big.
Right.
And, on and on. And that might even be where you found your next job is you went to your social group, your church or something. And hey, I'm looking for a job and somebody knows someone and there you go. So yeah. And it's also different between blue collar and white collar. And now maybe no collar.
Now no collar. Yeah.
There is no collar.
Well, so on this one, because this actually is a natural transition point, because one of the things that I've observed that ties into this thread in our discussion is in the last, it's probably been happening longer than this. People act like this generative AI is the emergence of AI, which it's not. But I think it was one of the first kind of spaces where people suddenly had this existential identity crisis where it became like, this machine could actually do at least large portions of my job.
Yeah.
And it freaked people out a lot, going back to some of the things we've been talking about, where it's like, well, they didn't really know who they were. They didn't really know what their contribution was and where they fit in. And so when all of a sudden, large language models seemed like, it could do it for me. It actually really created major disruption for people. But one of the reasons we're talking about this is why it's so important to think about the implications of the lessons learned over past years, because I think we're very much both aligned to the fact the stakes are a lot higher now. And if we don't figure some of these things out, the long-standing systemic consequences of it could be far more reaching than maybe what they were 30, 40 years ago.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, there's so many things in what you said. One is to recognize that the current awakening is really awakening for blue or white collar workers,
Yes.
right? In the past, I mean, talk to coal miners for the last 50 years. They've been like, tell me something I don't know.
Right. Right. Or if you worked on a factory floor, I mean, automation and robotics
you've been replaced every year.
Exactly.
So now, ask not for who the bell tolls. So it's coming for us, the white collar workers now. And we're no different than the past. Now, why it has an effect on humanity as a whole, though, is because the LLM systems in particular, by their very nature, they lock in a bias based on a point in time, right?
Okay. Yep.
Those language models are they're trained off of text and videos and whatever they've seen up to this moment, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
Which people forget because it seems like it's acting in real time,
it's like,
which
no,
it
it's trained.
is, but it's actually trained on information that has a static point in time.
Right. And you have to say, okay, well, what data was it trained on? Was it trained on all of the history of literature from Africa, from China, from parts unknown? Or was it trained on the standard canon of Western European white male blah blah blah?
Yeah.
What pictures was it trained on? Well, whoever has access to whatever the canon that they pulled the pictures from. I can guarantee you it wasn't a bunch of black and brown people, right? What data did it use to figure out statistics about crime? Well, I can guarantee you those statistics heavily lean towards black and brown people or criminals. So these biases are baked in and reinforced. This is the danger. Because if you say, okay, great, and start asking it questions, I'm about to give a loan to somebody. Here's the person's makeup. They're black, they're brown, they're Mexican, they're white. Should I give them the loan or not? Well, the bias says, no, you shouldn't because they're brown skinned and brown skinned people are unreliable. Okay. And that's that, right?
Yeah.
And if you ask the loan officer, the loan officer is going to say, well, the computer said.
Right. Because it's kind of the black box of AI. They just input stuff. They get the answer out the other side. And
no one's going to question it. Your loan officer isn't going to say, well, that model was based and it has some biases against your. I'm going to approve the loan anyway because forget that.
Right,
that's not going to happen.
Well, because they would be putting their skin in the game because all of a sudden it's like, wait, you overrode what the system told you to do.
Because they're not even in a position to do that. They're there to sign the papers. So you have to be very careful now to fight hard to at least recognize the biases that are in the system and try to counter the biases, right? By tweaking the model, by rewarding the things that are a little bit more equitable, stuff like that. And that's a battle, right? Because plenty of people say, why should we do that? It's approving the stuff that we want to get approved, and it's disproving the stuff we don't. It's rewarding the tribe I want, and it's not rewarding the tribe I don't want. What's the problem? Right.
Going back to something you said before, if you're in the predominant culture,
you're good.
Which again, regardless of what it is, if you're in the predominant culture and AI is doing things in your favor,
then you're happy.
Again, this is not just it's just you're going to be less likely to say, hey, hang on a second.
Yeah.
I don't like this. I think it should be going not in my favor because that's what would be right or fair.
Right. And it's not and maybe this is controversial, but it is not human nature to be fair. Human nature is to be tribal. and to be biased, right? I mean, you will defend your family first before you defend your neighbor's family. That's just the way it is.
Yeah.
It's an intellectual challenge to go beyond that and say, oh, wait. I know you were about to give me $100,000, but that wouldn't be fair. Why don't you give my neighbor over here 75 and give me 25? Because that would be more fair.
Right. Right.
It's
Or
like,
I just observed that person right next to me was rejected. Could you give my approval to them and reject me
yeah.
instead?
Yeah, it's like people don't do that. People will go, you got rejected. Oh, that's really, yeah, we should do something about, but you're approving mine, right?
Yeah.
So that's our nature. And you have to recognize that we're fighting against our nature to try to be more equitable. And that's why I don't have an attitude of they did it to me, woe was me, it's them. It's like, it's human nature. If you want yours, you have to go get it. If I want mine, if I want the system to be more equitable, more less biased against me, I have to work towards making it not as biased against me, right? I have to create the LEAP program to hire minorities. No one else is going to do that because it's counter to their interests. So I have to do that if I want that done. And over time, they'll hire more women and minorities themselves, right?
Yeah.
So I have to build those AI systems that have the bias I want to see. I can't just keep knocking on OpenAI and Google and saying, come on, please make it more fair for little old me. It's like, yeah, okay, whatever. You have to get out there and create systems that can compete, that people are going to use and reinforce. It's competitive. So, that's what we have to do.
So three things that out of this little last piece, and we'll see which one you kind of choose which path you want to go down first. But I think one of the things that I really appreciate about the way you describe this, that I think sometimes people don't think about, is just the complexity of what goes into artificial intelligence and all the implications that has. And this is where a big part of what I'm trying to do is help raise the bar on digital acumen for people to just even understand how this stuff happens, because it's very easy to other things when you just don't understand. It's like, hey, like, we're not saying AI is evil. We're just saying this is how it works. Yeah. So when it goes this way, these things just naturally, inherently get built into the system. So you have to know that's what's happening. Not so you can condemn it, but so you can go, okay, so what do we do to counter that?
Do you want that or not? Be conscious about it. Don't just be fooled.
Right. Right. Because I think it's easy to just like yell up, and I've seen it where people just yell about AI bias, and it's like, well, you can yell about it.
What are you going to do about it?
Well, now we're aware of it, so let's do something to correct it. But if people don't even know it's there, I think that's one of the biggest dangers, is people can just go, I don't know, the AI said it. And it's like, well, okay, yeah, but do you understand how it came to that conclusion?
Yeah.
And so then the other one is, you talked about the two different audiences with approaching this. And I think it's an interesting one because, one, what have you found successful to reach both of those different audiences? And we're talking about the majority group and the minority group, regardless of where it sits. Because again, to your point, you go to that majority group and you can say, hey, this is unfair. You need to do all that. And that can be met with massive resistance, because going back to it, it's not necessarily somebody consciously going, I don't like this other group. It may just be this like, hey, I'm watching out for myself. And if I'm going to choose between me and somebody else, I'm going to pick me. How do you lower those defenses to help people do that? And then to the group that may be on the other side of it, going back to, I don't remember who said it, but there's a phrase I tell people all the time, and people don't like it, but it's like, nobody's coming for you.
Yeah.
So like, if your goal is to sit back and point the finger and wait for them to fix it,
not going to happen.
It's not going to happen. Like, you got to go for it, because they're not.
Yeah.
But again, that can raise people's defenses. And obviously, ideally, yeah, it'd be great if it wasn't that way, but it's like, but it is. How have you had success in reaching both of those different groups with that message in a way that doesn't spike defenses and actually moves things forward?
Well, it's like we went through before. For the dominant group, you have to make it I'm going to say a business objective for them. You have to make them see how it enhances their life, basically.
Okay.
Hey, it's the fair thing to do argument never works. because we're not built like that. We're not built for fairness. I hate to say, but we're not. That works with your kids. That works in a small group. It works when you're building a little sports team, a little league or something like that. But out in the real world, our first thing is not, let's make this fair for everybody. Our first thing is, I need to get mine, right?
Okay.
So you got to be able to meet people where they are. It's like, okay, you want to get yours? You want to get more of yours? If you incorporate this group, you're probably going to get more, right? And there's all sorts of analogies you can come up with to say that sort of thing. But I'll use an example of Africa, the continent of Africa, 1.2 billion people. You've got to bet there's at least a couple more Elon Musks out there on the continent of Africa. So, I mean, he even came from Africa. So, so you got to say, I want to find the next Elon Musk. The best chance I have of doing that is not by limiting my scope to the 50,000 Ivy League school people that come out every year, but expand my scope to the billions of people out there in the world. I'm probably I have a higher opportunity to find geniuses if I expand my scope, right? Yeah. So that's one thing. For the others, the 2% or 10% or whatever, the minorities, I'd say, like you said, you can't sit around waiting for your equity share to show up at your doorstep. And the way I say it to people is, you don't want a seat at the table. Create your own tables, right? Don't just sit around waiting. Create your own tables. And especially in this world today where we have things like AI, and this is the new wizardry, right? It's like I told people a couple of weeks ago, it's like we've been handed magic wands. Now you can cower and go, oh my God, the new magic wand. I don't know what to do. It's going to take my job. It's like, yeah. Or you can pick up the magic wand and start, working some spells and recognize that there has been no time in human history that has empowered individuals as much as right now, right? The barriers to entry for hardware, for software, you don't even need money to do things these days. Not very much money compared to 10 years ago, where you needed $50 million to do anything. The barriers are so low, and the education and access to the technology and everything is so easy. Go out and create some new tables, right? It's not like, oh my gosh, OpenAI, that's it. There's not going to be any other AI. It's like, are you kidding me? They're just getting started. They just discovered the gold. Now let's go make stuff. Yeah. Right. So that's why I'm consistently telling the other group is, forget about those old tables. Don't fight to get a job to fix bugs in Windows from 20 years ago.
Repairing typewriters.
Yeah. Don't go trying to get the jobs to repair typewriters. That's done. Create new jobs. Right? Be creative. And I also point out to Black folks in particular, I say, look, if you watch the Super Bowl, at least at halftime, who's the entertainers? They were Black. Who are the top players? Well, at least on one of the teams, most of them are Black. Who's the top tennis star for the last couple of decades? Serena Williams, Black. Who are the top track athletes? Black. Boxers, Black. It just goes on. It's like Black people are everywhere. And it's not just about physical prowess. It's also about mental prowess. So it's like, we've got it going on. And we existed before a lot of these Europeans did. So we're probably as genius as we ever were. Let's go get it. Right? And it's hard because we're often portrayed in this downtrodden, and this is a U.S.-centric thing. You don't see this in Africa.
No, you don't see it outside the U.S. All the people I know outside the U.S. sometimes look at us like we're in a fishbowl.
It's like, what's wrong with you people? It's like, yeah, you are slaves. So, we went through this whole slave thing here. So it's baked into our mentality. But it's like, we are as on top of the world as anybody in the planet, so let's go get ours. So that's why I just try to encourage people not to shame us, not to say, you lazy son, get up off your, it's like, no. We've had it hard. but let's go. Right.
Well, and some of the things you brought up with that I think, again, as I listen to everything you're sharing, all this stuff is transferable. And what it's wisdom. Going back to, we were joked a little bit backstage where it's like, you're like, I'm an old dude, but it's like wisdom comes with experience with some of these things. And some of the stuff you're talking about, I feel like everybody right now would be wise to take the advice of some of these things, because it's the same thing I'm seeing right now when it comes to careers and stuff. People are looking at their jobs and going, oh no, what's going to happen to me? When are they going to fix it? And it's like, well, they're not.
They're not.
And it's going to happen to you. And if you just sit and wait, I had a conversation with a group of people the other day, and I said, look, if you're waiting for it, you will be the one that gets curb stomped.
Don't allow yourself to become a victim. You have to proactively go out and have a plan and say, well, what am I going to do? To ride this wave. Where am I going to get? Where's my magic wand? I want one.
When I love that. You've got the magic wand. Make a new table. Don't sit and go, well, when can I go sit at that table?
It's like, forget that table.
Screw that table. Yeah, that table's done. It's probably going to get tossed out next week. Go build a table that's going to last longer.
Right. There you go.
So, well, no, so with that though, I am curious, as you look at where things are, because you've obviously seen, I just even think in my own lifetime, some of the cycles of this stuff repeat, and it feels like it's new, and everybody freaks out and goes, oh, this is all new. And it's like, it's not new. This is just the next generation of some of this stuff. But I do think there are some legitimate things that we haven't had to deal with before. Are there any things, as you look at the way technology is moving, or you look at some of the risks on the table right now, that genuinely have you concerned, or where you go, hey, this is something that I actually feel very strongly we need to do something, and not we like somebody else do it, but like me personally, where I go, I actually think we need to step into the fray on this, or this is going to come back to bite us?
You mean things like corrective measures to take, or what do you mean?
Yeah. Exactly? Like, are there things that you just go, hey, I personally want to be involved in this, but I would want to raise awareness. Like, this is a corrective measure that I see, if we just ignore it and go, it'll work itself out, it won't work itself out.
No, there's nothing like that, because, well, I should say it like this. There's lots of things like that, but my reaction is not to point it out and try to prevent it. My response is to make sure I'm aware of it and make sure I work my countermeasures to it. For example, it's clear to me that humanoid robots are going to become a part of our workforce. All right. You can't stop it, because there's too much of a profit motive to make that true. Right. So that's going to happen. All right. Well, that's going to put a lot of people out of work. Now, and it's going to make some people super rich. Some of the people who are already super rich are going to become super, super rich.
Yeah.
My response to that is to say, okay, Black folks, why don't we get in the game? Why don't we create some humanoid robots? Why don't we create, or other kinds of robots? Maybe they're not humanoid robots. They're other kind of robots. What's our barrier to entry for that? Well, we were talking earlier. I was pointing at my little computer here and saying, I need to imbue this thing with some intelligence so that we can build robots more quickly and easily, just like the big boys are. So my response is to look at my fellow ancient wisdom infused tech buddies and say, we have a responsibility to contribute our wisdom as low on the pyramid as we can, so that those people have a chance. So instead of paying $6,000 for an experimental robot arm to teach our kids how to do robotics, let's come up with a robot arm that's more like $1,200 and is industrial grade and all this sort of stuff, so that our kids have a chance of getting in on that and spurring their creativity and stuff like that. So that's my response. These things are going to happen. The bias stuff is going to happen. There's no way in the world I can change that. The tide is too great, right? But I can create systems that collect data from different sources and try to make that system successful, right?
Yeah.
I can collect more. It's like, okay, I can't spend $10 billion like Microsoft is spending on OpenAI, but give it a year or two, and it's not going to be $10 billion to come up with the same result. It's going to be a few $1,000,000 because technology moves along. Let's know that that's going to happen, and let's be prepared for it. And let's start collecting data now so that we can train our own systems to compete with those systems in time, right? So that's how I view it. It's like, I can't stop certain things, and you can only raise certain awareness. And it's like, yeah, humanoid robots are going to do this and that. Biased AI systems are going to do this and that. Let's just build the systems that keep us in the game so that we don't end up being afterthoughts, right? It's like, well, the system wasn't built for you, so I guess you're going to starve.
Right. So those are, you just hit on two of them that I think are actually really tangible, practical things that people can think about on this. So like you said, you know, the fact that I agree, the robotics piece, it's an inevitability. So it's a matter of what do you do to prepare for that? And how do you, again, make it more accessible so that you can do it? I think the same is true with the bias piece. I've said for a while that the general, broad, wide reaching AI, generative AI that we see now, we're already starting to move past that. And people are going, that's really good, but it's like so general. We actually need it to be hyper specialized. And we're already moving into that age where people are spinning up new versions and going, yeah, our solution to everything can't be, let's just create an API to GPT-4. Like that's just not, it doesn't do a great job of that. We're going to need to hyper specialize in these certain areas. And you're starting to see some of those. Are there any other ones that you look at that just, you know, with your lens that you go, I think this is another one of those inevitabilities. So we talked about kind of the bias of the data. Yeah. We've talked about the robotics. Are there any other ones that to you, as you look over things that you go, I think this is another one where inevitably this is probably going to happen. So we probably need to just think about it this way.
Well, I don't know. There's just things where you think about, okay, AI broadly speaking is going to be ubiquitous. And I was having this conversation with my brother just yesterday, where I said, imbuing, I call these things computicles. You know, what is the smallest unit of compute and communication, and how much does it cost? And it's going to get smaller. I just think that we have to think deeply about how we give these systems desire. How do we code desire? Because broadly, and this is the most abstract that you can get, broadly speaking, I want these systems to be humane. I want them to care about me as a human and not optimize themselves for a profit motive that has nothing to do with humans at the center. That's my biggest fear, is that the systems we create will be optimized for profit motives and not optimized for humanity, right? And once you do that, you end up with things like, oh, there's a famine over here, even though there's plenty of abundance of food on the planet. Why is there a famine over here? Because those humans aren't needed. So we kind of optimized them out of the system. Food wasn't delivered over there, right?
Okay.
That's, if you had a humane motive and a humane goal, the system writ large would not do that. It would say, oh, there's people starving over here. Let's get them fed, right? Let's not just let them disappear.
Right.
Human
right.
life
Because on the surface, it looks like, well, that's a more optimized, quicker solution to our profit challenge, is to just ignore it.
Just ignore them. They're not contributing anything to our bottom line. We don't need them. So ignore them. And eventually they'll die and we'll move on. So you don't want systems that do that. You want systems that are humanity based. Yeah. You want those systems to be to care about us. Right? Because if they don't, we're dust. And they move on. They go out to the stars and everything, and we disappear. Right?
Well, and it's funny you bring that part up, because it is one of those areas where, and I think this is one of the challenges why raising people's understanding of how AI works and how to use it properly is so important, because going back to it, I think of your very early example of the loan officer that just gets the thing that says you've been declined.
Yeah.
And they don't really know how it
I
came
don't
to
know
the
why.
conclusion, or how, I don't know what it said. I just know it told me to tell you no. So I'm telling
Yeah.
you no. And I think with these AI systems, if we're not careful and we start handing over the keys
Yeah.
to decisions, and again, the decisions aren't being made with a diverse group of people around the table going, hey, what are we not thinking about? Or what are the implications of this? Or how are we actually considering this? We may not even know how it's making the decisions.
Right.
And we just end up going, well, it said to do this. And we
Yeah.
may not even know that it's deciding to do that with this kind of long-term implication, because we're like, it just said do that. So we're doing it. And that's, if anything, I feel like our human tendency of being lazy may actually
lead us
be
to that.
one of our biggest threats, is the fact that it's like, well, it's just easier to let the machine make a decision for me. I
Yeah.
don't know how it came to the conclusion. I don't know why or the implications of it. I just as soon say it said yes, so we'll say yes.
Yeah, there's a I don't know if you're familiar with the book Time Machine, H.G. Wells. But it's this guy builds a time machine, goes into the future, and he goes far enough into the future that he comes across this race of people, and they're kind of childlike, and they're just kind of sitting around, la-di-da, it's all paradise, their food needs are taken care of and all that. These are the Eloi, and then there's the other set of people who are the Morlocks, who are kind of ape-like, and they're animalistic, and they keep the machinery running such that the Eloi can live this life. And every once in a while, a siren goes off, a portal opens, the Eloi walk towards the portal, and some of them go in, and the doors close, and they go, okay, and then they go back to their play life. And what happens inside is the Morlocks are eating the Eloi. They're their food. And the Eloi are completely oblivious, like, oh, whatever. The siren goes, we go through the door, and who knows what happens after that, and we get this joyous life. So it's like, yeah, you have to be aware of what the machine is doing, and if you lose your own goals, if we don't have any humanity goals, we'll end up like the Eloi, because it's like,
Yeah.
well, who cares whether you get eaten or not eaten or whatever? Why are we even here?
Yeah.
Right. So
Yeah.
this is, I think I said at the beginning, I hope that we have, I think this all forces us, just like when I went to India, it forced me to say, who am I? Right. And define myself. I think
Yeah.
AI is getting in our face, and all the humanoid robots and all the rest is going to make us say, well, who are we? Why are we here? Who are we versus them? Because I'm not a robot.
Right. Right.
So what is my tribe here for? And am I fighting the robots, or am I using them as a tool? Am I threatened by them? So I think humanity has to deal with that, right? Hopefully now, and we don't just slide into it, because if we just slide, we'll just end up being wiped out.
Well, and I think it's a great place for us to kind of tie a bow on it, because I do think this is one of the things that I continue to see and try and drive forward, is this idea that, like, we have opportunity to influence this in a positive direction. And we have a lot more, going back to go make a table. We have more autonomy and control over some of these things than I think we realize. One of the most discouraging things I heard from somebody I was talking to recently was they were with a group of young business graduates who were, just finishing up their graduate program. And the person said, how many of you think you'll be automated? And 6 out of 10 raise their hand. And it's almost like that, the example you use with these creatures, where they just like accept. It was just like they'd almost just accepted, like, yeah, I'm going to walk through the door and whatever, and it'll be fine, type of a thing. And I think that's where I hope, if anything, technology pushes us to go beyond that and go, wait a minute. Like, let's not let that happen. Because I think of some of the things we're seeing with Congress and social media right now, where, people just kind of like bought into the whole social media thing, didn't really think like, hey, what are the implications of this? Where could this possibly go wrong? And decades later, we're now seeing some of the consequences of it. And I think we have an opportunity to not let history repeat itself, even though if you look at history, we don't always have the best track record of learning from the past so that we prevent ourselves from doing it all over again.
Yeah. So on a positive note, I think we have right now is a time where our magic wands have never been stronger. We just have to use them.
Yeah, completely agree. Well, I hope that encourages and inspires people who listen or watch this later, because I'm with you. I think, could it go south? It absolutely could. But could it also be incredible? And do you have a lot more control over that than you realize? And I'm actually very optimistic for where we'll go. So, William, I have genuinely really appreciated this conversation and just hearing from your experience and your perspective on this. And thank you so much for making the time today.
Well, Christopher, thank you for having me.
Yeah. Well, all right. Well, thank you so much again, William. Thanks to everybody who watched and listened. Hope you got something from this, and I will see you on the other side.